Ford entered the electric vehicle era with a thunderous confidence that felt almost cinematic. For a company with over a century of mechanical heritage, stepping into the EV battleground wasn't just a business choice. It was a declaration of relevance. With governments worldwide pushing aggressively for emissions reduction, Ford saw what looked like a once-in-a-generation opportunity, a chance to reinvent its brand as both traditional and futuristic. The Mustang Mach-E, Lightning, and future EV platforms were marketed as proof that Detroit iron could beat Silicon Valley sleekness at its own game. For a moment, the excitement felt justified. Pre-orders soared, investors cheered, and Ford claimed it had finally cracked the EV code. The story felt too good to fail, which is often the first sign of trouble. But beneath this rising optimism was an uncomfortable truth Ford tried to hide behind glossy marketing. Its EV strategy was built on speed, not stability. The company rushed into the segment as if a late entry automatically guaranteed market dominance. It underestimated how unprepared its supply chain was for the complexities of battery sourcing, thermal systems, chip dependence, and software integration. These weren't like updating a gasoline vehicle. They required an entirely new ecosystem that Ford had never built before. Internal documents later revealed that the Mach-E platform was initially a compromised design, modified from an existing project instead of being engineered from scratch. Ford didn't enter the EV era with confidence. It entered with fear of being left behind. While Ford celebrated early reservations, another problem quietly grew. The cost curve of EV production wasn't dropping as quickly as analysts predicted. Battery prices were still volatile, raw materials fluctuated wildly, and Ford was locked into contracts negotiated during peak commodity pricing. For every Mach-E sold, the margins were either razor-thin or outright negative. Ford's bore hope scale would eventually fix the losses, but scale only amplified the cost sink. The more Ford pushed, the more it bled. The EVs were selling, but not profitably, and the internal financial strain began to ripple through the company's long-standing operations. At the same time, Ford misread its customer base. Traditional Ford buyers, truck owners, rural buyers, utility fleet clients, weren't ready to abandon internal combustion at the pace the corporate strategy demanded. Ford bet heavily on a cultural shift that didn't happen. Many customers were intrigued by EVs, but not convinced enough to switch, especially when public charging networks lagged behind expectations. Even the F-150 Lightning, Ford's future flagship, found itself trapped in a strange paradox. Admired, reviewed positively, technologically impressive, yet unable to win over the mainstream segment that depended on range, towing consistency, and long-distance flexibility. These early cracks didn't look catastrophic at first, but they set the stage for what would become an intensely satisfying downfall for critics, analysts, and even loyal customers frustrated by Ford's overconfidence. Ford wanted the world to believe it had transformed into a tech giant overnight. Reality was far less kind. The company had entered a race it barely understood, and as the industry evolved, Ford's EV narrative began collapsing faster than it could generate new marketing slogans. The first visible sign of the downfall began with swelling inventory. By 2023 to 2024, dealerships started reporting parking lots full of Mach-Es that customers had reserved but never picked up. Reservation conversions fell dramatically, and Ford's once-celebrated wait list evaporated. Ford responded with aggressive price cuts, a move that impressed consumers but devastated profitability. Every price cut was a public confession that demand wasn't meeting expectations. But Ford couldn't stop. The EVs wouldn't move otherwise. Meanwhile, the used market was already punishing EV resale values, creating a vicious cycle where new buyers hesitated because depreciation was brutal. Then came the software problems, the Achilles heel Ford never anticipated. OTA updates failed frequently, infotainment bugs multiplied, and owners complained of random shutdown warnings and inconsistent charging behavior. Ford wasn't a software-first company, and the EV world exposed that weakness ruthlessly. One viral story about a lightning bricking after an update forced Ford to halt production temporarily, sending a ripple of doubt across the industry. Critics argued that Ford was trying to retrofit a tech culture into a century-old manufacturing environment, and failing. Meanwhile, competitors like Tesla and BYD were moving with terrifying speed. As the problems mounted, Ford's EV division became a financial sinkhole. Quarterly reports confirmed billions in losses, each statement worse than the last. Investors who once applauded Ford's boldness now questioned whether the strategy was sustainable at all. Ford quietly shifted its messaging. Instead of aggressively promoting EVs, it began emphasizing hybrid expansion and balanced propulsion strategies. Internally, the panic was growing. Ford executives admitted that the EV market was softer than predicted and far more price-sensitive. The company realized it wasn't competing with Tesla. It was competing with its own gasoline lineup, which remained stronger, cheaper, and more desirable. The public downfall accelerated when Ford halted several EV projects it had once claimed were essential to its future. Planned three-row EV SUVs were delayed. Next-gen platforms were re-evaluated. Battery plant timelines were pushed back. Everything Ford had hyped with confidence suddenly became negotiable. This wasn't a strategic pivot. It was a retreat. Ford wasn't evolving. It was scrambling. And every delay signaled that the company's EV plans were collapsing under their own weight. By the time analysts pieced the story together, the narrative had shifted completely. Ford's EV downfall wasn't loud or sudden. It was a slow, methodical unraveling. Quiet cancellations, hesitant press releases, paused investments, shrinking production goals, all wrapped in corporate optimism that fooled no one. Ford entered the EV war with bold ambition, only to retreat bruised, financially battered, and painfully aware that the EV transition wasn't a marketing challenge. It was a technological revolution Ford was never prepared to lead. The most satisfying part of Ford's EV downfall, especially to industry skeptics, came when the company finally admitted reality. In a rare moment of humility, Ford acknowledged that pure EV adoption would be slower than expected, and that consumers weren't moving in the direction policymakers predicted. Ford had gambled the future on a trend that turned out to be less universal and more niche than anticipated. With every financial report declaring billions in losses, the illusion of EV dominance dissolved. Ford was no longer trying to beat Tesla. It was trying to stop burning cash fast enough to survive its own strategy. Dealers, once pressured to embrace Ford's EV push, became some of the company's loudest critics. Many had invested heavily in chargers, equipment, and training because Ford demanded it. But when EV sales stagnated, dealerships were left with expensive infrastructure that produced no return on investment. They protested publicly, pressured Ford to slow down, and argued that the demand simply wasn't there. This backlash damaged Ford's credibility and exposed how top-down the EV transition had been. Forced rather than organic, theoretical rather than practical. At the product level, Ford's engineering teams faced brutal pressure to fix systemic issues that stem from rushed development. The Mustang Mach-E's charging speed lagged behind competitors. The Lightning's real-world towing range shocked customers who expected gasoline-like consistency. Owners reported cold weather performance drops, battery degradation concerns, and repair costs that far exceeded their ICE counterparts. Ford attempted incremental improvements, but the EV market wasn't patient. Buyers compared everything to Tesla and BYD, companies that already operated at an entirely different scale and efficiency. Ford eventually pivoted back toward hybrids, loudly promoting them as the true compromise of the future. The shift was ironic. Hybrids were the very segment Ford had ignored while chasing a full EV fantasy. Suddenly, hybrids became Ford's savior product line, the technology that would give customers choice, as executives diplomatically phrased it. But behind that language was an admission the world understood instantly. Ford's EV experiment had crashed into the brick wall reality. The company had to return to what it understood: mechanical engineering, not software empires. By the end of this downfall, Ford's EV story had become a case study in overconfidence, rushed execution, and misreading market psychology. It wasn't just that Ford failed. It was that Ford created the conditions for its own failure. The downfall wasn't tragic. It was predictable. Ford tried to leap into the future without understanding the terrain, and the landing was as painful as critics long warned. In the end, the most satisfying part of Ford's EV downfall wasn't the collapse itself, but the lessons it forced the company and the entire industry to finally confront. Ambition without preparation is just a longer path to failure.